And I'm going to check my calendar. And we're with Jenni Field, and I'm super happy to have her. So today, coincidentally, is going to be my UK day. And what I mean by that is that she's over there in the UK, and I'm going to be speaking later on today for somebody else in the UK. So it just feels like I'm connected across the pond with the UK somehow today. So I'm going to turn over to Jenni, let her introduce herself. We're going to talk about communication today, specifically crappy communication and how it impacts company culture. So Jenni, take it away.
Thank you. It's really lovely to be here. So just to introduce myself to everybody, my name is Jenni Field. I am the founder and CEO of a consultancy called Redefining Communications. I've worked in communications for around 20 years. I have published a couple of books. I have published some research papers. And the research papers have been focusing on how to communicate with deskless workers, because that's often quite a challenge. And culturally, that's quite interesting as well. And also some research into line managers and the role of line managers. So as a consultancy and on a sort of day-to-day basis, we spend time helping people be less chaotic by helping them communicate better. So we work with different clients around the world, focusing on things like leadership, communication and behaviors, looking at culture and communication, and really getting to the root cause of some of those symptoms that we see culturally or otherwise, and how we can make those better, but dealing with the actual reasons why they're happening, not just the symptoms that we see on the surface. So that's what I spend my time doing. It's lovely to be with you, Chris.
Yeah, I think I've had you on the radio show a few times. We did a webinar together, but it's been a hot minute since we've seen each other. So it's always great to see you. How did you get interested or curious, or what was sort of that path for you to, dive into the communication?
So it's going back a long time now. So I did a degree in marketing because I had to have a degree to get a job in PR and communications. But I think for me, it goes back to almost being at school. My interest was always in communication, how people behave, why we behave in certain ways. My dissertation at university was on consumer behavior and why we choose certain things and not others. So I've always been interested in that. And when I started my career, it was very much focused on internal and external communication. And I found the external communication a little bit more formulaic, I suppose. So having a bit more of a focus on internal communication for me was more interesting, because I felt like I was having an impact on people who go to work. And we spend so much of our time at work that to make that a better place just felt so much more rewarding and fulfilling. So that's what I've been focused on doing for sort of the last 15, 20 years now.
Yeah. Well, I noticed that communication this year has been chaotic. With my clients, the people I've been speaking, I mean, it just feels like we took 2 steps forward during the pandemic. Communication got really high. Everyone was like really thoughtful. Of course, we had a few extra hours, with nothing to do and nowhere to go, to maybe be a bit more thoughtful and communicative. And then it feels like we took 9 steps backwards this year. And speaking of crappy communication, I have seen a rise in the crap sandwich of communication. And for anyone that doesn't know what that is I'm going to pay you a really crappy compliment. I'm going to give you this compliment we all know probably, or some fake good news that we all know isn't really sincere. And then we're going to hit you over the head with all the bad news. And then we're going to end with another crappy little compliment, right? And somehow think that that's going to make things better. And all of the research says, all the, sort of cognitive biases and everything else, it's better to start with the bad news. It's better to be upfront with people and say, hey, this is what's going on. This is what we got to deal with. And then end with good news. Have you been seeing sort of a trend with this? Is sort of I don't know, trying to soften the blow for people with some of the stuff that's going on. Oh, got to come back to the office, or, we're totally, we promised you all these things and now we're not going to do them, or whatever it is, right?
Yeah, and it's so interesting that you use the word chaotic there, because we've been using that as a business for about 4 years. And this is the first year where I feel like people are very uncomfortable accepting the word chaos, whereas before everyone was like, oh, this is a great way of describing it. I think it feels a bit too real now, and that's uncomfortable. So what we are seeing is not dissimilar to you. And I think it's coming from a place of where people aren't very comfortable with accountability a little bit. And I think people are a bit lost. So I wrote something recently about the fact that we're in a bit of a test and learn phase at the moment. It is a bit chaotic. It is wonky because we don't really know how we work anymore. We're sort of really coming out of that pandemic phase where things were forced upon us and no one really knows what they're doing. And people aren't being given the freedom to test and learn. So leaders who are saying, right, we're now going to be in the office 3 days a week, are just, being berated online for making that decision, but they have to be given the time to test that, to see if it works, to see if culturally it's beneficial, to see if the people that work there want to stay, to see if it attracts other people that want to come to an office. But we're not having that freedom. So I think that's what's making people feel quite nervous, and therefore they're not communicating the most effectively because they're too worried about that sort of comeback, or maybe having to change their mind and then being sort of told off for doing that as well. So I think that's happening a little bit. I think that whole crappy sandwich is just a tried and tested method that people come back to again and again. And you're right, it doesn't work. Just be really upfront and honest and say what's going on and just move forward. But I think we're trying to find ways of sort of sugarcoating things. Someone said, I was at an event recently where we were talking about disinformation and misinformation. And someone said, if misinformation is intentionally sharing information that's inaccurate, that's just lying. And I thought, oh, it is. We've just successfully rebranded lying. And I hadn't really realized it. And I think we're in a bit of that stage. We're kind of rebranding stuff to try and make it sound better when actually you're just lying. So that's where I feel like we are.
Yeah, and not to bring in the whole remote work debate into this. I know we're talking about communications, but it does feel like there's this lying going on, right? People felt lied to about what was going to happen, and now they sort of feel like they're being lied to about, are we really coming back a couple of days a week, or are you just eventually going to make me have to come back all the time, right? And so when a company's not being sincere with us, when they're not being authentic, I think that's when ultimately those sort of bonds of trust are broken. And then it's like, well, what else aren't you being truthful with, right? And that's really when we have to, I think great cultures are transparent, right? And we have seen some good examples of companies that have said, listen, we don't know, and we're going to try this, to your point, we're going to do this thing, and then we might change our mind or we might keep it. Well, we don't know. We're just going to try to, and such a different reaction from employees, right? When you're like, we're going to make the best decision we can. We might screw it all up. We don't know. We're just going to try and then we'll report back what we found out. How much is transparency a part of that equation to have great communication?
For me, transparency is huge. I think it's your second pillar in the book? I can't remember where it is,
well,
but it's definitely up front. I don't know if the numbers are important, but it's definitely an early pillar. And it is really important, but it's also quite easily weaponized transparency. I've had it done to me as a leader where people have sort of, weaponized the word. And working with a client just the other week, we were talking about kind of defining what that means, because it can feel quite uncomfortable in commercial organizations to be more transparent. We can't possibly, but what does that mean? What does transparency really look like for us? And I think that's important culturally to define. I also think there is something around being clear if something is a test. So again, I had this conversation recently where people were putting in a sort of employee sort of voice forum sort of space to make sure people had the chance to feedback and listen and do all those great things. But the goal for the organization was for that to probably stop in about a year's time, on the basis that they should have put enough other things in place to not need that specific forum for something specific. But I said to them, you've got to communicate this. Otherwise, people are going to think they've got a turn in the forum and it's going to be their turn to sit at the table. If you don't say to everybody, look, we're going to do this for a year because this is our intention, this is our plan. We'll update you every kind of quarter about what's going on. People are fine with that, but not being open about what your intentions are is what does diminish trust. And I think trust is a massive one for us culturally, and communication and trust are so linked that, we know that you have to be face-to-face if you want to really build trust from a communication perspective. So there's lots of things in there about communication and trust with transparency all thrown in.
Yeah, so we can get ourselves in a lot of trouble if we're just transparent, and then it's like, listen, we can open the door and say, hey, everyone, guess what? Now we're selling this thing. And then you shut the door. Okay, you were transparent, but you've left out now one of the other pillars is listening. So we have to allow then that opportunity to have discussions, for people to feel heard. Maybe the decision's not going to change. Maybe we're going to keep doing what we're going to do. But for people to have that opportunity, I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've worked with leaders who are like, listen, I feel like I'm constantly in the middle. I'm delivering news from above me to below me, and I'm in the middle. I'm getting just absolutely hammered. And I'm like, just go ask your people what they think. Just, instead of trying to show up with your battle gear on, ready to like fight them because you just got done fighting with somebody else, sometimes they just want to be heard.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And it's so much easier said than done. I think that's part of the problem from a culture perspective is, what's important is that you take action, and you talk about that in the book around that action sort of, you've got all the pillars, but you've got to take action with it. And it's all well and good sitting and listening, but if you're not acting on that and linking that together, why will people share with you how they feel? Why will they feel psychologically safe? They won't, because you're either performatively listening or you're not listening at all. So there's got to be that kind of action alongside it. Otherwise, it's just pointless.
Yeah. And it just really seems to grow, right? It's like something that just becomes, I don't know, we used the word chaotic earlier, but maybe explosive would be the next word, right? I mean, if you're just, if you're screwing up transparency and then you're screwing up listening, I mean, you just got a lot of unhappy people. And then it just becomes this, like, I don't know, place to get a paycheck.
Yeah.
Where people are working, but they're not really, they don't really care. And man, does that you jump that chasm so quickly, but it is so hard to bring them back, right? Once it's messed up.
Yeah. And I think you've also got to think about what people care about, because I think that's different. And this is linked a little bit, it's quite top of mind for me from the research we've done into deskless workers, is there are some people that are working in an organization that's quite vocational. So the customers that they're serving have to use that service, whereas there'll be other people working who are working maybe in a retail environment that feel quite connected to the brand. They're quite different motivations for working. They're quite different reasons to be engaged. I'm either engaged in the task or I'm engaged in the brand. I might be a little bit of both, but usually one is stronger than the other. That's really important for us to understand from a communication and culture perspective, because that's about motivating you. It's about what drives you. And that's ultimately what we're trying to get underneath, to help people want to do a great job, but also just enjoy coming to work and not feel that horrible Sunday dread that we can quite often feel, that we don't know we feel until it stops.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I have seen some really good companies struggle because they did try to be transparent. They did try to listen. But then they failed to communicate back to everybody that, hey, I heard you and this is what we did about it. And then they'll go do something about it, but not really communicate that to everybody. And then senior management's frustrated going, well, they told me they wanted this thing and I went and did it. And then they didn't care. But there wasn't this like constant loop. I remember years ago having to like tell all of my managers, you have to know which people on your staff will read it, which ones will listen to it, which ones have to be told 3 or 4 times. And they're like, that's exhausting. And I'm like, welcome to leadership.
Oh, I love that. Yeah. Welcome.
Right. But you have to be, it's like, do you want to be right or do you want to be effective? Right. It's like, if you want to be effective, you're going to have to tell them and tell them and tell them again. And then when you're pretty sure they've got it, tell them again. And in different ways, in different mediums, if it's important, we've got to keep that thing. And that's true about talking about values. That's true about, hey, I heard you with this thing and here's what we did, right? It's over and over and over again because everyone's so distracted. Yeah. This dumb thing is keeping everyone from paying attention to what's really happening all the time. And so we are fighting for their attention. And so to be, again, really good communicators, that's a way for us to maybe get some of that attention back.
Yeah, 100%. And it's about communicating with your audience. So I always say to people, one of the 6 keys to impactful communication is communicating for them. You're not communicating for yourself. And this is something that I think a lot of leadership teams with the best of intentions can really fall into the trap of, like, we need to communicate this, we need to share this, we need to, but what do they need to know? Like, what do they need to know to do their job? What do they need to know to feel connected? What do they need to know to feel part of a team? Like, think about the audience first. And if you can't articulate that or say why you're sharing that, then you have to ask why you're communicating in the first place, because it's very easy to just be very noisy in organizations with lots of content going out. But if you just check in on that, that's really important. And if you're doing that, the next level on is, what do you want people to do with that information? How do you want them to feel? What do you want them to think? And what do you want them to do? Think, feel, do. That's really important, because sometimes you'll be doing something and thinking, oh, I really want people to do something differently, but you're just sending out an email. Like, that isn't going to change someone's behavior. If you really need them to do something differently, to your point, there probably needs to be someone that can listen to something, someone that can see it visually, someone that can have some, FaceTime to talk about it and discuss it. There's lots of different things that are needed to shift that behavior. And that's what we have to think about culturally, is what's the right ways to communicate for our culture and what's going to get us the outcomes that we need.
We've heard a lot from people that, hey, does this really need to be a meeting, or could you have just sent an email? And I laugh about that, because, I think the reason that a lot of leaders call those extra meetings is because people didn't read the email, right? And so they're like, listen, I can send an email, but if nobody reads it, then I haven't communicated the thing, and I got to make sure they know the thing, or else I'm going to be in trouble. We're going to have a problem. And so I would certainly love to kind of hear any tips or tricks that you have. One that I always did is at the bottom of the email, not the very last sentence, but pretty close to the last sentence, I would put in something silly like, please reply to this email and tell me your favorite monkey, or tell me your whatever. And it was just something silly. And if most of the team wrote me back, I felt like most of the team read the email and I don't need to have a meeting. If one person wrote back with that, and that's that one person who reads the email all the way, because that's who they are. oh crap, we got to have a meeting. And I got to review this again, right? It was just sort of like a litmus test for me to know, did they really take the time to read it? Did they comprehend it or not? Because if they didn't get to the bottom of the email, I'm in trouble.
Yeah.
Right?
I love that idea of having something at the bottom. I might try that and see if it works. But the meeting thing's really interesting. And I often, and I'm not saying this just because I'm on with you, but I often refer to your meeting types in your other book, Remote Work, in terms of kind of, and that's just around having some kind of structure around what's this meeting for. And that's sort of a build on the importance of being very clear. Is this meeting for a decision, a discussion, or for information? And the reason people get frustrated is because they don't know why they're going to a meeting. And time is our most precious commodity. So if you want half an hour of my time, then I'd like to know why. And I used to do this when I was communications director for an organization. I used to get asked to go to meetings all the time, as you do. And it got to the point where I was like, I don't know why I'm going. So I remember saying to the HR director, can you just let me know why you would like me at the meeting? Because I've, obviously lots of other things going on. And she said to me, I just really like it when you're there. And I was like, okay, well, I'm not going to come, because as lovely as that is, I have got other things I need to do, and I'll just catch up on the minutes. But it's okay to ask what, can you just let me know the agenda? Can you let me know what the meetings, what's the outcome of the meeting? And that's a real cultural shift. We work with a lot of clients who have lots of meetings and think there's too much noise, but it's actually a symptom of something else. So just be purposeful with them and just make sure people know why they're happening. And if it is to support an email or other things, then make sure it's a different thing. So if there's an email that's gone out to announce something, then use the meeting as a discussion about that, or to listen, or to get feedback. Don't just read the email out in the meeting. That's just crappy communication. So how can you make it, work together? That's the important thing.
Yeah. And so in the second edition here, right behind me, the Power of Company Culture, I talk about those meetings. I also talk about them in the other book, the last book, Remote Work. And you're welcome to take them, steal them, rename them. I don't care. But the point is, Jenni brings up a great point that, understanding why we're going to be there is super important. And also, what is my role? So like we do cockroach meetings, which is just, hey, I got a little problem. Can you hop on and help me real quick? I just need someone, a couple of people to just help me like brainstorm or help me get me unstuck. Cool. I'm going to show up. I don't have to do anything. I just got to help you. I just got to listen real quick. I can do that. That's like a 5-minute favor. No problem. a tiger team meeting is like, hey, I need you to come. This is a long meeting. Here's the agenda. I need you to present what you did for that client last time. I mean, it's a big deal. Or I just need everyone to show up and shut up because I got to tell you, I got to download all this stuff that I've learned so that you all can go figure out how to do your jobs differently now because the world has just changed. Right. And so, I'm going to show up and just listen. But it is amazing to me how many people call meetings and are invited to meetings. And to your point, have absolutely no idea what's going to happen, what's expected of them. And then leaders get pissed off because they're like, well, my people weren't prepared or they didn't know what they were doing. And it's like, well, they didn't know what they were supposed to do. Like, give them 3 sentences of a freaking agenda and let them show up and be awesome for you. Because most people, I have found, especially in business, they are slow processors. And what I mean by that is they need time to be exposed to something and they need time to go back and think about it and then come back with whatever they would do. You and I are probably like, you could probably throw something at us and be like, okay, cool. I mean, we could just start going because that's who we are. But most people I find want time to process. And honestly, I'm that way in certain things in my life, but like in business, I gotta show up on a podcast and like just talk for 30 minutes. I don't need to know what questions in advance, but most people need that time, right? To like really be intentional and thoughtful. Maybe they don't feel as psychologically safe or they don't want to make a mistake. They don't want to say something stupid. And so they need time to think about what they're going to do in that meeting.
Yeah, you're right. And I read a book called Surrounded by Idiots at the start of this year by Thomas Erickson. And it's based on the DISC profile, but it's basically around that, about the 4 different sort of profiles and how they deal with communication, how they deal with conflict, all those different things. And that's really helpful when you know what kind of color you strongly identify with, and then understanding all of the different colors and what people kind of need to be able to thrive. I think what's also really important is designing for the minority to benefit the majority. And that's really what we're trying to think about from a communication perspective sometimes. So I've talked about deskless workers a bit. They're the hardest people to reach. So if you did all of your communication based on trying to reach them, you'd probably benefit the majority. If you know that the minority of people might need to have stuff, really written down in detail, then do that, because then you can work backwards from that and create, shorter, snappier pieces. So it's about making sure that you're addressing everything, dealing with all the different sort of types of people that you might have in the organization. And that's so important culturally to be inclusive, because it's one of the biggest challenges that we've got, especially now that we're, around the world, people are working at home. It's very different ways of working. So making some of those changes is hugely helpful for everybody, which is really important.
So we have a great question from Emma McMillan. She says, Jenny, you talk about meeting noise being a symptom of something else. What do you think this kind of cultural behavior is a symptom of?
So it's a really good question, Emma. Thank you. Hello. So one of the reason I say that is because we've just been doing some work with a client who asked us to observe meetings because they felt like there were just too many. So we observed some of their meetings to understand sort of the structure, different meeting types. And then we started to plot the meetings in, and we could see where they were fitting in sort of the calendar. But the reason that they felt like there were too many meetings was because there wasn't that structure. So there wasn't a clarity for people in terms of what was expected of them on attendance of the meeting. Alongside that, there wasn't a huge communication infrastructure. So with the lack of an infrastructure of communication, and by that I mean things like intranets or newsletters, means that you kind of default to email and meetings. That's all you've got to play with. So that's where it was symptomatic of a lack of communication and just cultural challenges around not being clear on what the meeting was for, what's expected of you, how long that meeting is. And there's little changes you can do there to make a difference. But I think once you do that and you put different structures in place around communication, the meetings should reduce because you can get that information from somewhere else and you can do things slightly differently. So that's what I mean about it being kind of a symptom of something else. It can feel like we have a lot, it can feel like this, but actually it feels that way because of something else. So let's find out what's going on and then we can fix that.
Sort of the last thing as we wrap up here that I wanted to ask you about is I've had this very controversial take over the last few years is as we've had more and more flexible work, people kind of all over the place, I think that as that increases, we should be having less and less rigid, structured, on the calendar one-on-one meetings. And what I mean by that is that I find that leaders spend all of their time in these, we meet on Mondays for an hour, it's our designated one-on-one time. And what happens is that no one knows that's happening because we're in it's not like I see you going into the boss's office and I know you had a meeting, and there's a lot of information that happens when I know you've met with somebody. But also they tend to wait to make decisions until they have that one-on-one time. Like that's the designated time to get my boss to agree to do whatever or to catch me up on whatever. And then the boss ultimately cancels about half of those because they get busy and they're on the road and they're moving around. And so I find it's like this complete, ridiculous, like screwed up thing. It just, everything gets kind of broken and everyone seems to be upset. The managers feel like they're in one-on-ones all the time. The employees feel like they can never get anybody's attention. And so I'm a big advocate for shifting all of that communication, or 99% of it, into the group meetings. Why are we not, as a group, talking about how we're doing? Why, as a group, we're not talking about our goals and how we can achieve and how we can support each other, instead of it being all on the leader to do once a week for an hour? And for God's sakes, repeating the same thing as a leader over and over and over again to all of your direct reports, instead of just doing it in a team setting, and then leaving the one-on-ones for, hey, this is a project thing, right? We need to actually work together on something, right? As opposed to, let's do a status update at 9 a.m. on Mondays. I don't know what your thoughts are about one-on-ones, but I kind of hate them, especially in a flexible remote work thing. Like I'm more group therapy than I am individual therapy, right? Like I want to go with the group and let's talk about it. So I don't know, what are your thoughts?
So I think it's really interesting. And I remember we've spoken about this a little bit before, just over the years since we've known each other. And I know people have a very violent reaction to your suggestion that we shouldn't have one-to-ones. So I'm probably somewhere in the middle, but more on the side of groups. So as a team in my organization, we have team meetings every Monday for a few hours, either online or in person. And we have a monthly kind of full day in-person session. I don't have any one-to-ones with anybody. I don't have a very big team, so I don't really need to. And everyone needs to know what's going on with everybody. If I need to speak to somebody specifically about their role, or we need specific time that would be, quite frankly, boring for anyone else to be in, then that's a one-to-one. But otherwise, we all need to know kind of what's going on. I think it's important to have kind of development conversations, some of those that you can have as a team, but I think then to maybe finesse those or discuss people's learnings or certain specific things, you need them. My worry would be if you took them away completely and then you needed to have a one-to-one for performance management reasons. Any one-to-one that goes in the diary could then evoke a fear in people, like, oh, there's only a one-to-one when someone's in trouble, that might not be the case, because you might want to shift to do things, but we've created this dread of a one-to-one. So there's that. The only other thing I'd say is that you leave your calendar open, like just make sure people can see where you are. So if there is this case of, I can't see that people are going into an office, which you can't, then have the calendar open so people can see what you're in. But you mentioned something in that example of the boss cancelling one-to-ones. I hear that all the time. I haven't had a one-to-one with my boss for 3 months because they cancel it. That is awful. That is like the worst thing you can do. Just don't put it in the calendar and find a different way to work, because that is making people feel uncared for and it's just horrible. Whereas you can work differently. We use systems like monday.com, we have WhatsApp, we have, different things that we use in business to keep each other updated. So our meetings are very efficient and people can easily dip in and out of work when they're working to know what's going on. So it's moving away from what we did in the pandemic, which was this kind of lift and shift, which we had to do. Now you've got to find what's the right way of working for your organization. And that old lift and shift model of, we used to do one-to-ones, now I'm going to do them online, and that just won't work. It's different. So you've got to find different ways to communicate.
Yeah. And I just find it, if you can have a good team dynamic, and if you have a great team and there is that psychological safety, and we can talk about those things, we can work together on all of that. We're going to lift each other up, and we're going to provide that support and that development and all those things together. And that takes some of the pressure off the leader. right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And you're right. You can't spend all, as a leader, you'll just find yourself, welcome to leadership. You're in meetings all the time. But there is something, it comes back to some of the stuff we've touched on around communicating in lots of different ways. There will be some people that would rather have a one-to-one. They don't want to be in a team environment to share some of those things. So I would always say to people that this is what we're going to do. See how it goes. If you want to change it, we can. Happy to have a monthly one-to-one, whatever it might be. But things like the weekly one-to-ones where you're spending 2 days in meetings with teams and repeating yourself, that's got to be a thing of the past. With the technology and the ability to connect so quickly now, that shouldn't really be the norm, in my opinion.
Yeah. And if people get nothing else with this, it's shift most of that communication and most of those things back to the team and save that time when you are going to meet with somebody one-on-one for much more important things, whether that's work or maybe that person, because there are times when people do need support. They're going through something. Maybe they are struggling at work. Maybe they're not performing. Yeah, absolutely. You're going to have some one-on-ones. You're going to have conversations. Absolutely. I just don't like the rigid, thing that people, they're not even doing it very well. And yet they say, I have to have it. And then they're not doing it. So I don't know. It's crazy. Well, you've been lovely as always. Thank you so much for being here and supporting and really leading the way with communication. You're doing awesome. I love seeing all the stuff that you're doing. And I always get a kick of every time I see one of your pictures, you're always laughing. So you always make me smile whenever I see you smiling online. So thank you for all the great stuff that you do.
Oh, thank you. It's been a pleasure to catch up again, and congrats on the book. It's brilliant. So I hope lots of people pick it up.
So wherever you are, if you're around the world, you can pick it up right now. It's right here. You can go on Amazon or Bull or Kogan Page, wherever you want to pick up your books. If you're in the United States, you got to wait till Halloween. It comes out on October 31st. You can pre-order now. There's a link in the comments here. And I hope you'll consider doing that. So thanks again for being here, and have a great rest of your, rest of my day, rest of your evening. So go back and relax and whatever you do. Thanks again, Jenni. I appreciate it.
Thank